Square Enix has a way of averting expectations when it comes to its productions, both new and old. From turning Final Fantasy into an action-oriented RPG instead of focusing on turn-based strategy, to producing a beat-em-up that has yet to see a sequel following its appearance on the PS2, it's hard to predict what the minds behind Square Enix will come up with next. With the arrival of Sony's PlayStation 5 came the opportunity for Square Enix to unveil its newest IP, Forspoken. After some enthusiasm-reducing previews and a free demo, this open-world action RPG experience is here for gamers to potentially appreciate. Having played the demo like many others, my excitement was tepid, but I came in with an open mind, hoping my first impressions with Forspoken would be dashed in the most magnificent ways. Players take control of Alfred Holland, known as Frey throughout the game's entirety beyond the opening cutscenes where the resident New Yorker is facing a potential jail sentence for thievery in various forms. Given a second chance, Frey finds herself harassed by gang members, almost shot in hilarious fashion, and burned out of her home, left wandering the cold streets until a glowing bracelet transports her to the medieval setting of Athia, a world consisting of documents sporting the years set in the 32nd century. A long-winded opening 2 or so hours witnesses Frey and her van-braced companion she dubs Cuff being introduced to the infliction-destroying society that Frey calls the Break, and interacting with some of the few NPCs that get screen time without much character development. The player is allowed the chance to explore the rather extensive map, broken up into sections sporting varying degrees of terrain, and most importantly, when it comes to completion, a plethora of optional objectives. Taking a cue from Ubisoft's design strategy, the Luminous Productions produced game pads as rather short main story runtime by placing hundreds of icons on the map representing tasks like monuments that can give Frey an addition to certain base stats, including increasing her strength or overall health. Present time trials where the players will have to defeat respawning hordes of enemies or sneak up on mystical cats that, when successfully petted, join Frey whenever she enters one of the safe houses known as Pilgrim's Refuge scattered around the map, where she can upgrade her equipment, craft healing items, and accept in-game challenges that enhance each spell Frey can learn, either through automatic scenes, purchasing with mana on the skill tree. Mana is usually collected via blue hazes bellowing out of the ground throughout Athia, or diving into an enchanted fountain. These challenges usually include performing that spell a certain amount of times under specific conditions, like defeating 25 enemies vulnerable to the spell's elemental property. Monuments are only a small sampling of what's available to the player if they want to experience everything, from liberating fortresses of foes, to completing the few side quests offered throughout the main story's entirety, to fighting optional bosses known as abominations. After 43 hours, I finished the main story on normal difficulty, while trying to complete a lot of the optional content, such as taking photos with Frey's cell phone at designated spots to show off to a pair of kids who have never been outside of the only area with living humans in Athia, Sepal. When the 13th chapter representing the endgame began, I took advantage of Frey's traversal abilities to scour the map in ways she couldn't during Chapter 5 or even Chapter 10. Ticking off the necessary requirements to gain the Platinum Trophy, including completing the 105 spell challenges, defeating every boss again in a time trial environment, and attaining all of Frey's equipment, with one piece of gear being located in a nightmarish area featuring aggressively respawning enemies bombarding Frey on a narrow mountain. This quest for the Platinum, while upping the difficulty in several aspects, took me another 16 hours to put this one and done playthrough at the near 60-hour mark. Not long before Forspoken's full release, a cutscene showcasing Frey's amazement over her newfound magical powers became gaming's latest tiresome meme. But in truth, the awe of Frey's magic-based abilities don't end after the supposed cringy moment, as she is eventually gifted with 4 elementally fused spell sets: Earth, Fire, Water, and Electricity in that order, with all 4 sporting 3 categories of usage: Attack, Support, and Surge. While every attack spell can be charged up, Their varying forms and elemental properties work differently, as each magic attack also has 3 subcategories per spell. For example, Seela's fire-based attack spell Blast Slice produces a spear that is automatically thrown and explodes upon piercing an enemy that will do damage to nearby foes as well. Whereas Rage Slice sees Frey rushing forward and throwing haymakers like Tifa from Final Fantasy VII. After upgrading each spell via the skill tree, both attack and surge spells can be charged to level 3, with devastating effects, including the latter's range expanding exponentially. Surge attacks are essentially Frey's limit break or super maneuver, where the meter in the spell menu's middle fills up when successfully using attack and support magic. Once filled, pressing the 2 buttons associated with performing attack and support spells at the same time will unleash the surge magic attack. But just like every other spell, enemies can interrupt surge attacks if the player isn't careful. As expected by the name, support spells are rooted in buffing Frey and, depending on the magic, debuffing an enemy. Frey's initial support spell set will allow the player to cure her of poison with Leech, while Disperse provides a temporary flower turret that sprouts from the ground. As varied as attack and surge magic are, support spells increases the level of experimentation, with the player being able to stack buffs, debilitate foes, and build up the surge meter by constantly switching between spell sets. Sadly, the game drip feeds the unlocking of spells, with the last set only becoming available after the 10th of 12 story-based chapters, meaning a majority of experiencing the electric elemental powers will happen post-narrative. Another big factor in Forspoken's gameplay is the traversal system. Frey's magic-infused parkour maneuvers work exponentially well when moving throughout the map, with new abilities being unlocked by the player to really make Frey seem like a superhero, be it using the shimmy to bounce off the ground for some increased momentum after a jump, or floating inside a bubble from one elevated pillar to another in hopes of reaching that far-off monument. But the parkour system isn't just for getting Frey from one point to another, as it plays a pivotal role in avoiding death in battle. By using well-timed dodges and jumps, the player can have Frey avoiding attacks and even temporarily stunning foes. With successful attacks and avoidances during battle, a rating meter will appear in the top right-hand corner. The higher the rating, the experience points gained after finishing the last enemy is multiplied up to 2 times, while the potential item drop rarity is also increased, making it imperative during those early hours to get the best rating possible and keep it high. As if there weren't enough systems in regards to combat, there is Frey's gear that too is broken down into 3 categories: cloak, necklace, and nails. Frey's cloaks and necklaces have base stats when attained, connected to boosting her health, defense, and the strength of whatever spell set is currently available. These pieces of jewelry also sport up to 4 slots to add supplementary effects, like increasing the chance of landing critical hits, though some cloaks and necklaces have the slots automatically set and may or may not be the most beneficial, including decreasing attack magic power in favor of auto-healing during battle. Nails, however, have no upgradable stats and only 2 slots with predetermined effects that should help Frey. For everything that Forspoken offers in terms of combat options and gear loadouts, the enemy AI is lacking, no matter if the player has switched the settings to make each battle the hardest possible. Adversaries range from overly annoying birds, shuffling infected humans, or shielded warriors who need to be shot in the face or from behind. Larger foes throw out unblockable maneuvers frequently that not only damages Frey heavily, but will also send her flying skyward in dramatic fashion. Every enemy has an elemental property, with the opposing element being the apparent road to victory. Yet even when the word resistant pops up when attacking a foe, constant usage of said elemental attack will still put that creature down rather quickly, especially if the player is geared up fairly well. This waning difficulty as the narrative progresses and the player goes about exploring Athia also affects one of the environment's most interesting implementations, breakstorms. Happening randomly, breakstorms envelop particular portions of the map at any time the game sees fit, to not only blacken out the surrounding area alongside blustering winds, but also starts infinitely spawning gigantic, ethereal creatures known as nightmares that, when initially confronted in the story, will have the player hitting the use healing potion button frequently until they opt to keep fighting or run away before death overwhelms Frey. Sadly, by the time the player attains the water elemental spells, nightmares become woefully easy, even if the player hasn't focused on picking up or modifying Frey's gear, mostly because a nightmare's water-based vulnerability. For all of its positives and negatives in terms of combat, what really has gained the ire of gamers almost everywhere is the dialogue. A majority of the time, Frey and Cuff will banter back and forth in a fashion that emphasizes Frey's fish out of water thinking in this world that Cuff apparently knows very well. As the main story progresses, there's actual tonal shifts in their relationship, with Cuff becoming more aggressive when the plot dictates. Sadly, moving throughout Athia, their communication barely changes, with dialogue exchanges heard in the first few hours being repeated, even post-story, far too frequently. The most underwhelming narrative aspect has to be the plot's general presentation, with an interesting premise, hampered by typecast NPCs, underwhelming villains who barely get any screen time until the last 2 chapters, and side quests that do little to add any incentive to help those plastic-faced people. Frey, though understandable in her intent of getting back home, doesn't prove too likable for the first few chapters before the third act changes her dramatically, during an extensive information dump where an entire chapter is essentially a walking simulator with cutscenes sprinkled in to break up the monotony. Technically, Forspoken is a mixed bag. Athia's map is massive, with some impressive differing regions in terms of presentation. Sadly, the textures associated with these environments are mostly muddied or too similar in terms of what can or can't be jumped off of when Frey tries to attach herself to a rock. Enemies can blend into the setting way too easily due to the game's muted color scheme, and frame rate drops occur at any time, be it during a simple moving through the world or when confronted by a horde of enemies, even when the game is set to performance mode on a PS5. The camera and lighting can prove troublesome, with the prior being the cause of Frey being hit by enemies off screen, especially flying foes, as it's hard to keep up with their movements, even when using the in-game lock-on system, while lighting may prove too inefficient when taking on foes in a forest or blinding the player upon exiting a building. Thankfully, general stability is remarkably solid in a grandiose game like this, featuring no soft or hard crashes throughout 60 hours of play. Another aspect of Forspoken that must be praised is its accessibility options. Beyond the display and sound options is full controller layout changes that the player can use to make everything feel easier to play. One of the most impressive settings options is making the game easy or as difficult as the combat can allow in its current form, including increasing or decreasing how much damage Frey can take or how fast her stamina replenishes to perform those parkour maneuvers, even if the overall difficulty is set at normal. Forspoken, for all of its ideas and positive aspects, falls into the same open-world trappings of its genre-rooted predecessors, with a short-winded story featuring unlockable or unremarkable characters, a plethora of map icons to complete, and a combat system that is both satisfying thanks to the tools given and disappointing due to enemies failing to adapt to the growing power of this outsider-turned-hero. Though given a lot of flack initially, Forspoken isn't an inherently terrible game broken at the seams and failing to inspire. The combat from beginning to end has flares and flashes of greatness, with the traversal system making exploring an empty world enjoyable, especially when the task at hand is to finish up a nearby part of the extensive checklist needed to get a potentially useful, though eventually unneeded new piece of gear. Even if this game sounds like something interesting from a gameplay perspective, because the story is lacking no matter how one looks at it, Forspoken is a perfect wait for a sale experience, as it really does nothing unique, but is still quite enjoyable a majority of the time. If someone doesn't want to wait and buys it at full price, there's a good chance the player will want to slap themselves for spending so much money on a simply solid experience. Like Frey verbally assaulting Cuff for stressfully asking if she is okay after falling from a dangerous height onto a bed of rocks.
Here, kitty kitty. Come to mama.
What is it about them that addles your brain so thoroughly?
Are you kidding? Kitty power, that's what.
Baddies really rather quickly.
Probably because you're starting to make yourself useful.
Frey, are you hurt?
What do you think, genius?
Oh, good. You're well enough to be unpleasant, at least.